My name is Harper Vance. I am 31 years old, and I am the lead designer and master gemologist at Vance & Co., the fine jewelry house my grandfather built from a single workbench in the back of a pawn shop into one of the most respected names on the East Coast. The night of my engagement party, I stood under the chandeliers of our own flagship showroom in a champagne silk dress, my grandmother's diamond drop earrings catching the light, and I believed I was standing at the beginning of the best year of my life. By the time the band stopped playing, I would understand that I had spent the last 3 weeks quietly building the only thing standing between me and losing everything I had ever earned, and I hadn't even realized I was doing it. The toast had barely finished when my father tapped his glass and asked the room for quiet. He smiled at me the way he always did right before, disappointing me, warm on the surface, calculating underneath. Then he looked past me, toward Derek, my fiancé, and said the sentence that stopped the air in my lungs. "Before we celebrate," he said, "there's a document Harper needs to sign tonight. Just a formality." Derek did not look at me. He looked at my father, and in that one silent exchange between the two men I trusted most in this world, I understood that something about my life had already been decided without me. I did not reach for the pen he was holding out. Instead, I reached into the small clutch I'd carried all night, the one everyone assumed held lipstick and a compact mirror, and closed my hand around 3 weeks of my own careful, quiet work. I should have known the moment my father called me by my full name that afternoon, before a single guest arrived. He never said Harper Elizabeth unless he needed my signature on something he didn't want me reading too closely. That afternoon, I finally didn't let it pass. I grew up believing Vance & Company belonged to all of us, in spirit if not always on paper. My father, Charles, ran the business side, the wholesale contracts, the bank relationships, the endless dinners with buyers from Manhattan and Miami. My mother, Renata, handled the showroom's image, the launch parties, the magazine features, and I handled the stones. Every diamond that came through our doors, every emerald, every antique piece someone brought in hoping it was worth a fortune, passed across my table first. I was the one who could look at a stone under a loupe and tell you within 30 seconds whether it was exactly what the paperwork claimed. My younger brother, Caleb, had never wanted any part of the business. He was 27, restless, funny, the kind of charming that gets you forgiven for things I would never have been forgiven for. He drifted between failed startups our father quietly bankrolled and never mentioned at dinner. I loved him. I also knew, somewhere under that love, that he had never once had to prove himself the way I had. Every single day, for a decade. Derek came into my life 2 years earlier at a trade show in New York. He was 34, an independent stonebroker who sourced rare pieces for private collectors across 3 continents. And he had a way of asking questions that made me feel like the only interesting person in a room full of diamonds. On our first date, he asked about clarity grading and cut proportions instead of asking what my last name was worth. After years of men who wanted to know exactly that, I found him impossible to resist. We got engaged after 16 months. My father approved so fast it should have worried me. He praised Derek's contacts across the Gulf and Southeast Asia, like a man reading off a business plan instead of blessing his daughter's marriage. I told myself it was relief. He'd spent years worried I'd stay married to the workbench forever. I understand now it was something else entirely. 3 months before the party, Derek started spending long afternoons in my father's office instead of mine. When I asked what they discussed, I got the same 2 answers. Different mouths, same emptiness behind them. "Business logistics," my father said. "Just consulting," Derek said. I let it go, at first. I trusted them both completely, which I now know was exactly the mistake they were counting on. The first crack came 2 weeks before the party at a Sunday dinner. Caleb mentioned, almost carelessly, something he'd overheard about the restructuring. The table went quiet in a way that made even the silverware sound too loud. "Nothing you need to worry about," my mother said, reaching for her wine before she'd even finished the sentence. "If it touches the business, I need to worry about it," I said. "I sign off on every major acquisition. I'm the one whose name is on the certifications." My father set down his fork with too much care. "The business is fine, Harper. Better than fine. We're making adjustments to protect the family's long-term position." "Protect it from what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Derek and asked whether the appraisals on the new collection were finalized. Derek said yes, without once looking at me. I remember that exact second more clearly than almost anything else that year. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. It was simply the first time I noticed that certain questions made my father and my fiancé trade a glance that cut me out of my own table entirely. As if I were a guest at a business I'd spent 10 years earning my place inside. I told myself I was imagining it. Engagements make people tense. Families carry old weather under polite conversation. Caleb probably misheard something, the way he misheard most things. But small details kept piling up, the way sediment settles at the bottom of a glass, until one day you realize the water was never as clear as you thought. The following Monday, doing something I had never once done in 10 years at the company, I stopped by the front desk and asked Priya, who had managed our filing and compliance for almost as long as I'd been alive, whether she could pull the shareholder registry for me. I told her I needed it for a personal insurance form. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did need it, just not for insurance. Priya had worked for my grandfather before she ever worked for my father. She hesitated for exactly 1 second too long before she said she'd have it by end of day, and something in that hesitation told me she already knew more than she was going to volunteer. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a document I had never actually seen in 10 years of working there. 35% of Vance & Co. was held under my name, designated as founders' shares, issued the year I turned 25. I had known vaguely, the way you know a fact about your own birth you weren't present for, that my grandfather had left me a stake in the company. I had never once seen the actual filing. Buried in the bylaws, in the dense legal language I'd spent a decade reading on contracts for stones instead of contracts for myself, was a single clause I read 4 times before I trusted it. Any transfer, pledge, or restructuring of founders' shares required the written, notarized consent of the shareholder of record, obtained no less than 30 days prior to execution, filed with the state, and witnessed independently of any officer of the company. My grandfather had not left me a heartfelt letter. He had left me something better, and something I had simply never bothered to read until a folder marked Restructuring made me curious enough to look. I photographed every page with my own phone and put the registry back exactly where I'd found it, before Priya noticed it had ever left her desk. A week before the party, I walked into my father's office to drop off a grading report and saw that same folder on his desk, labeled simply Restructuring. I didn't open it in front of him. I'd been raised to respect boundaries in that house, even the ones that were never extended back to me. But that evening, working late the way I always did, I let myself back into the office alone and read every page. The plan was dated 3 weeks earlier. It designated my 35%, still held in trust under my name, to be transferred into a newly formed entity called Coal Stone Partners, Derek's company. I read it twice before the meaning settled into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. There was no notarized consent form attached, no 30-day filing, nothing that came close to satisfying the clause I'd spent a week memorizing. They were planning to do this illegally, and they were counting on me never reading the fine print of my own inheritance closely enough to notice. That same week, I overheard my mother on the phone. Her voice dropped into the register she used for conversations she didn't want reaching the kitchen door. "She doesn't know yet," she said. "Charles wants to wait until after the party. Easier once it's settled." I stood frozen in the hallway with one hand on the banister, listening to my own mother discuss keeping something from me the way she might discuss switching caterers. Once it's settled. Settled how? Settled by what? And why did it have to happen before the party instead of after? I didn't confront her that night. I told myself I'd wait. Gather the full picture first. The same patience that had made me good at my job for a decade. Look longer. Don't react before you understand what you're looking at. Instead, on Thursday, I did something I had never told anyone in my family I was capable of doing quietly. I called a corporate attorney named Naomi Chin, whose name I'd gotten years earlier from a colleague at a trade conference and had never once needed until now. I told her everything: the folder, the clause, the timeline. She asked me to send her copies of everything I had, then asked one question that made my stomach drop. Has anyone asked you to sign anything recently? Anything that seemed unrelated or minor or last minute? I thought of the offhand comment my father had made 2 days earlier, mentioning something about updating my employee agreement before the wedding. Nothing to worry about. Standard paperwork. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time. I think they're going to try tonight, I told her 2 days later, standing in my bathroom in my engagement dress with my phone pressed to my ear before the first guest had even arrived. At the party. Then don't sign anything, Naomi said. Not tonight, not under any pressure, no matter what they call it. And Harper, if they push, you don't need me standing in that room. You already have everything you need to stop them. You just need to say it out loud. I did not fully believe her, not yet. So the following morning, before work, I did something that had nothing to do with trusting Naomi and everything to do with trusting myself. I drove to the county records office on my lunch break, the kind of gray municipal building I had walked past 100 times without ever once needing to enter, and requested the original certificate of incorporation for Vance & Company, along with any amendments filed in the last 5 years. The clerk who handed me the folder had no idea what she was giving me. To her, it was a routine request, one of a dozen she probably processed that day. To me, it was the difference between believing a private document Priya had pulled from our own internal system, which my father could theoretically claim had been altered, and holding a public filing, time-stamped, notarized, sitting in a government archive my father had no access to and no ability to quietly revise. The language matched exactly what I'd photographed at my kitchen table. Founder's shares, 35%, my name, the same clause about written and notarized consent 30 days prior to any transfer. I stood in that records office reading it 3 times, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and felt something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with certainty. Whatever happened at the party now, I wasn't relying on my father's version of the truth, or even Priya's memory of it. I had my own copy, filed with the state, in ink neither of them could touch. I photographed every page a second time and asked for a certified copy before I left, paying the $12 fee out of my own pocket like it was the most important purchase I'd ever make. There was one more piece I hadn't found the courage to look at directly. Something that had been sitting at the edge of my attention for weeks without a name. 3 months earlier, we had closed the largest single sale in the company's history, an 11-carat Colombian emerald to a private buyer in Dallas, just under $3 million. I had graded that stone myself. I remembered the inclusions clearly, small internal fractures near the girdle that limited it from the top grade, the kind of imperfection only someone trained to look for it would ever notice. The sale had closed at the flawless price anyway. I had asked my father about it once, in passing, and he'd told me Derek had done an independent review and found the stone cleaner than my initial pass. I had let it go, because doubting my own eye after a decade of trusting nothing else felt like doubting the one thing about myself I'd never had to question. The night before the party, unable to sleep, I logged into the company's shared drive from my laptop and searched the Dallas file. 2 grading certificates sat inside it, both dated within 2 days of each other, both carrying my name. The first was mine, inclusions noted, grade capped accordingly. The second was not. Same stone, same case number, a conclusion I had never written, calling it flawless and museum grade, my credentials and what looked, at a glance, exactly like my signature attached beneath it. I sat with my laptop glowing in the dark for a long time before I understood what I was looking at. Someone had built a second version of my professional judgment, wearing my name, to justify a price they had already promised a buyer. And they had done it well enough that if I hadn't spent 10 years learning to read my own handwriting under pressure, learning the exact angle my pen made when I was tired versus when I was certain, I might never have noticed the letters sat a fraction too upright, too careful. the signature of someone copying confidence rather than feeling it. I printed both certificates. I photographed the shareholder registry. I saved every email where Derek had answered a question about the restructuring instead of my father. Every message where my mother had asked me not to worry about something I clearly should have been worrying about for months. By the time I stood under the chandeliers the following night in champagne silk, I was not the woman my father and my fiancé believed they were about to quietly outmaneuver. I was carrying, in a slim folder tucked inside my clutch, 10 years of proof that I had earned the right to decide my own life, and 3 weeks of proof that they had planned to take it from me anyway. "Before we celebrate," my father said again, holding out the pen, "there's a document Harper needs to sign tonight. Just a formality." I did not take the pen. "What document exactly?" I asked. "And why does it need 90 witnesses and a live band instead of a conference room and 30 days' notice?" The room, which had been humming with champagne-warm conversation a moment earlier, went quiet in patches, the way a held breath spreads outward from wherever it starts. My father's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes recalculated. "It's simple paperwork, Harper. Consolidating some of the ownership structure to reflect Derek's involvement going forward." "You mean transferring 35% of my founder's shares into Cole Stone Partners," I said, "without the 30-day notarized consent the bylaws require, and without telling me it was happening at all until you handed me a pen in front of everyone I know." Derek went very still beside me. I felt it before I saw it, his hand tensing against the back of my chair. "How do you—" my father started, then stopped himself, which told me more than finishing the sentence would have. "I read," I said. "It's the one skill nobody in this family ever thought to worry about." I set the folder on the gift table, the same table stacked with wrapped boxes and cards from people who had come to celebrate what they believed was the beginning of my marriage. I opened it to the first page. "This is the shareholder registry my grandfather filed the year I turned 25, I said, loud enough now that I wasn't performing quiet dignity anymore. I was simply done whispering in my own home. 35% founder's shares, held in my name. Any transfer requires my written, notarized consent, filed 30 days in advance. There's no filing. There's no consent. There's only a document you were hoping I'd sign tonight without reading it, the way I've signed things for this family my entire life. Harper, it was always going to benefit you," my father said, his voice dropping into the reasonable register he used on buyers who were about to overpay for something. "You'd still be lead designer. Nothing about your day-to-day changes." "Except who owns it," I said. "Except who actually controls it. Derek would have final approval on every acquisition above a certain value." I read that part too. I turned to Derek, at the ring on my finger that suddenly felt impossibly heavy, at 2 years of dinners where he'd asked about clarity grading like it fascinated him more than anything else on earth. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked him directly. He looked at my father first, seeking permission to answer, and that told me everything about where his loyalty had actually lived the whole time. "Since before you proposed," I said, answering my own question. "You didn't fall for me and discover the business later. You knew about the trust and my grandfather's stake first, and you fell for the opportunity before you fell for me." "That's not fair," Derek said, finding his voice. "I do love you, Harper. The business and my feelings were always separate." "Were they?" I asked. "Because from where I'm standing, you let my father draft paperwork to take my ownership 3 weeks ago and never once mentioned it. If you loved me the way you say, when exactly were you planning to tell me? Before the wedding? After?" He had no answer. He never had one, only the practiced warmth that had worked on me for 2 years because I wanted so badly to be loved for something other than my last name. My mother spoke for the first time since I'd opened the folder, her voice thin. "Charles, is this true? All of it?" "Renata, I did this for the family, for the company's future. I was protecting what your father built." "You were protecting yourself," I said quietly. "From what? I still don't fully understand. But you were never protecting me." I looked around the showroom. 90 guests, family friends, buyers, people who'd known me my whole life, all watching in silence as the party they'd come to celebrate quietly took itself apart in front of them. "If I refused to sign anything tonight," I said, to the room as much as to my father. "The transfer stays unsigned. My ownership stays exactly where my grandfather put it, which means the only question left tonight is why you were willing to break the law he wrote specifically to stop this, in front of every person who trusted you enough to be here." My father's jaw tightened. For the first time all evening, he stopped looking like the confident head of a company and started looking like a man calculating risk in real time. "Take off the ring," I heard myself say, not entirely sure if I was speaking to Derek or to myself. He stared at me, stunned, like he genuinely believed that whatever happened tonight, I would still choose him in the end, the way I always had. "Harper, please, we can figure this out." "There's nothing to figure out," I said. "You already figured it out 3 weeks ago, without me." I slid the ring off and set it gently on top of the shareholder registry, the same ring that an hour earlier had felt like the beginning of a life with someone who loved me. I turned to my brother, standing near the champagne table with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, something closer to shame than surprise. "Caleb," I said, "you knew about the restructuring before I did. What else do you know?" He hesitated, glancing at our father, and for a moment I braced myself for the same silence I'd gotten from Derek. Then something in his face shifted. "I overheard Dad on the phone with Derek 2 weeks ago," Caleb said slowly. "They mentioned the Dallas file. Dad said something like, 'As long as the paperwork holds, nobody's going to question a stone that already sold.' I didn't understand what it meant. I do now." The Dallas file. I reached back into my clutch and pulled out the 2 grading certificates I'd printed the night before, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. "I graded an 11-carat Colombian emerald 14 months ago," I said, turning to face my father fully now. "My report noted inclusions that capped the grade below flawless. The stone sold to a private buyer in Dallas for just under $3 million, at the flawless price, on a second certificate carrying my name and a conclusion I never wrote." The color drained out of my father's face the way it does from a stone held too long under a hot light. "Harper, the inclusions were minor," he said. "Derek reviewed the stone independently and agreed with the higher grade." I turned to Derek, who would not meet my eyes. "You knew," I said. "You knew my name was on a forged certificate, and you let it stand because it closed the sale, and the sale made you look exactly like the kind of partner my father wanted controlling this company's future." "I need everyone who isn't family to give us the room," I said, and to my surprise, they did, filing out slowly, murmuring, several glancing back at my father with expressions I didn't have the energy to interpret. Derek lingered near the door, hoping for one more moment alone with me, and when I didn't look at him, he finally left too. My father called me the next morning, before I'd even had coffee, his voice stripped of the calm authority he'd worn like a second suit for as long as I could remember. "You could have come to me privately," he said, "before all of this, before 90 people watched me lose everything I built." "I did come to you privately," I said. "For 3 months I asked what the restructuring meant, and you told me it was nothing, and business logistics, and things I didn't need to worry about. I gave you every private opportunity you could have wanted, Dad. You used every one of them to keep lying to me more efficiently." He was quiet for a long moment. "I never thought you'd actually go looking. I thought you trusted us." "I did," I said. "That's exactly what let this go on, as long as it did. I don't think you understand yet that those are 2 different things. Trust and blindness. I'm done confusing them." "What happens now?" he asked, and for the first time in my life, I heard something in my father's voice that sounded almost like fear of me, rather than fear for himself. "Now the state finishes reviewing the filing I already made," I said, "and you spent some time thinking about why you believed protecting this family meant deciding, alone, what I was allowed to know about my own inheritance." He didn't have an answer for that. I let the silence sit there until he was the one who ended the call. What followed took most of the next 3 months, though the worst of it unfolded within the first week. I called Naomi the next morning and asked her to formally notify the state that no consent had ever been filed for the transfer, closing that door permanently before anyone could claim confusion about the timeline. Then I asked her the harder question, the one I'd been avoiding since I first saw the two certificates side by side. If I report the forged signature, what happens to my father? That depends on what you want to happen, she said. Fraud under a licensed gemologist's credentials is serious. It's also provable if the signature analysis holds up, which from what you've shown me, I think it will. But you're allowed to decide how this unfolds. You don't owe anyone a specific kind of justice just because you have the evidence for it. I thought about that for 2 days before I decided anything. What made the decision for me, in the end, was not anger. It was the 3 buyers whose names sat quietly in the file next to mine. People who had trusted a signature that wasn't real. 2 more sales, one in Miami and one in Chicago, turned up the same pattern once Naomi and I pulled the full record, my honest grade on one certificate, a forged, flattering second version on another. Each one timed to close a sale my father had already promised at a price my real judgment wouldn't support. I called all 3 buyers myself. I felt they deserved to hear it from me rather than from a lawyer's letter. 2 arranged independent regrading and accepted a settlement Naomi negotiated on the company's behalf. The 3rd, the Dallas buyer, pursued formal action, which the company resolved without a trial once the evidence made the outcome obvious to everyone involved. The state licensing board opened its own inquiry once I reported the forged certificates, since my credentials had been used without my knowledge. I was never implicated. My father was. He stepped down as director of Vance & Company 8 weeks after the party, not because the board forced him out immediately, but because the board of trade buyers we depended on made it clear they would stop working with the company otherwise. He avoided criminal charges only because the buyers, once compensated, chose not to pursue them. He did not avoid losing nearly everyone's respect in a business built almost entirely on trust. Derek's brokerage collapsed within 3 months once word moved through the trade circuit. Nobody wants to work with a broker whose judgment turned out to depend on someone else's forged signature. I heard secondhand that he relocated to Chicago. I didn't ask for details, and nobody offered any unprompted, which I appreciated more than I expected to. My mother and I didn't speak easily for a while after that night. I came to believe she genuinely hadn't known about the forged certificates, but she had known about the ownership transfer, and she chose silence over warning me. The conversation that finally cracked something open between us happened almost 2 months later in her kitchen, when she asked me quietly whether I'd ever forgive her for staying quiet. "I don't know yet," I told her honestly. "I know I understand it better than I did that night. You spent 30 years married to a man who confused controlling people with protecting them. I don't think you were protecting yourself the way Dad was. I think you were surviving him the same way I almost did." She cried at that, the first time I'd seen her cry since the party, and something between us started to rebuild, slowly, the way you rebuild a house you're no longer certain is structurally sound. She sends me photos of her garden most weeks now. I've started replying. Caleb surprised me the most. My brother, who I'd spent years quietly resenting for never having to prove himself the way I did, turned out to be the one person in my family who chose honesty the moment it mattered, even knowing it would expose our father. He works at the company with me now, in a real role this time, learning sourcing and grading from the ground up instead of being handed a title. He started by asking Priya, of all people, to teach him how to actually read a shareholder registry. I think that says more about him than anything else could. Priya, for her part, told me once, months later, over coffee in the break room, that she had known about the restructuring folder for weeks before I asked her for the registry, and had been quietly hoping I would ask the right question before it was too late. She never volunteered it outright, she said, because it wasn't her place to, but she'd been ready the moment I was ready to look. "Your grandfather used to say the same thing about buyers who came in nervous," she told me. "He never told them the flaw in the stone outright. He just handed them the loop and waited to see if they'd actually look. As for the company, I now hold my 35% outright, fully protected, fully mine, exactly as my grandfather structured it 3 years before he died, in language dense enough that almost no one had ever bothered to read it properly, including, for most of my life, me." I became lead designer and majority decision maker on every acquisition, a title I earned twice over, once through a decade of honest work, and once more through 3 quiet weeks when I finally stopped assuming the people I loved would tell me the truth on their own. I kept the shareholder registry. It sits in a frame in my office now, beside the loupe my grandfather first put in my hand when I was 9, teaching me to look closely enough to see what was real underneath what someone wanted me to believe. I think about that lesson often, applied far beyond stones. People show you their true composition eventually, if you're patient enough and honest enough with yourself to actually look, and if you're willing to do the reading yourself instead of waiting for someone to hand you the answer. The signs were always there, in my father's careful silences, in Derek's practiced warmth, in a folder marked restructuring that I could have kept ignoring out of a respect for boundaries that were never extended to me in return. I don't regret trusting them as long as I did. I regret only that it took a shareholder registry I had to go looking for myself, a signature I had to learn to doubt, and a room full of strangers watching me finally say it out loud to teach me what love should never require. It should never require silence, and it should never require someone else's permission to read your own name off a document that was always yours to understand. I didn't walk away from that engagement party with revenge. I walked away with my grandfather's 35%, my name cleared of a fraud I never committed, and something I hadn't realized I was missing for most of my adult life: my own authority over my own story. That, in the end, was worth more than any ring, and it was something nobody could have handed me. I had to go find it myself, 3 weeks before anyone thought I was even looking.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.